April 6, 1944. 4:47 a.m. A German soldier on morning patrol at Monte Cassino stopped walking. He stood completely still. In front of him in the gray pre-dawn light, 60 men in British uniforms were staring back at him from ground that no living enemy was supposed to be able to reach. He did not speak. He did not reach for his rifle. He turned and ran. Within 3 minutes, the garrison commander was awake. Within 5, he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at those 60 men on the ledge below him. He had held this position for 4 months. He had stopped 3 full Allied assaults. He had concrete machine guns, pre-registered artillery, and 150 trained soldiers inside his walls. He had every advantage, and he was about to surrender without firing a single shot. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and moments of extraordinary courage from the past. This community is built for people who believe that the most unbelievable stories are always the true ones. What you are about to hear is the story of 60 men from the hills of Nepal who were handed an impossible mountain and decided the word impossible was a suggestion, not a fact. A Subadar named Lal Bahadur Thapa. A farmer's son. A man whose neighbors back home did not even know he had a medal. A man who on one specific night in April 1944 looked at a cliff that every military expert in the Allied command had already declared unclimbable and said, "I'll take 60 men up that tonight." The result: one German garrison, 150 men, surrendered without a single bullet fired that morning. A siege that had killed thousands and stopped the entire Allied advance in Italy for 4 months, broken by 60 soldiers with knives and the willingness to climb in the dark. This is how it happened. By the winter of 1943, the Allied campaign in Italy had stopped moving entirely, not slowed, not stalled in the way campaigns sometimes stall before finding momentum again. Stopped. Completely. Permanently. Like a machine that had driven itself into a wall and could not find reverse. The reason had a name. Monte Cassino, a mountain that rose to over 500 meters above sea level, sitting directly across the only road that led north toward Rome. On top of it, or rather carved into it, positioned around it, dug beneath it, the German 14th Panzer Corps had built what military historians would later describe as one of the most sophisticated defensive systems of the entire Second World War. This was not a line of soldiers standing behind rocks. This was an engineered killing ground. Concrete bunkers reinforced to withstand direct artillery hits. Machine gun positions with overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach from every angle. Artillery pre-registered on every flat piece of ground below the mountain where infantry might form up. Barbed wire, minefields, observation posts that could see movement from kilometers away. The German commander, Albert Kesselring, had looked at this geography in the autumn of 1943 and understood something that the Allied commanders were about to learn the expensive way. There was no route around Monte Cassino. The mountains on either side were impassable for any force large enough to matter. The Rapido River sat at the base cold and fast, with no cover on either bank. Everything that moved toward Rome had to come through that valley, into those guns up those slopes. Kesselring had taken a natural bottleneck and turned it into a fortress. The first Allied assault came in January 1944. The American 36th Infantry Division Texas men crossed the Rapido River in rubber boats under direct fire. The German machine guns had been waiting for exactly this approach. More than 2,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded in a crossing that lasted less than 48 hours before it collapsed. The men who survived came back across the same river they had crossed going forward, and some of them did not stop shaking for days. The second assault brought a decision that haunts military historians to this day. The ancient Benedictine monastery at the top of Monte Cassino, founded in 529 AD, was bombed on February 15, 1944. The Allied command believed German observers were using it as a forward position. The bombing killed hundreds of Italian civilians sheltering inside. It did not significantly damage the German defensive line. And, in a bitter irony that nobody had anticipated, the rubble created by the bombing gave the German paratroopers, who moved in afterward, even better cover than the intact structure had provided. The German flag kept flying. The road to Rome stayed closed. The third assault, launched in mid-February, was backed by some of the heaviest artillery bombardment of the entire Italian campaign. Hundreds of guns firing for hours before the infantry went in. The noise was audible from 50 kilometers away. The ground shook continuously for hours. And when it ended and the soldiers advanced, the concrete held the Germans emerged from their bunkers, and the attack gained almost nothing measurable on a map. 4 months. 3 major assaults. Thousands of Allied soldiers dead. The road to Rome remained closed, and senior commanders were running out of ideas that they had not already tried. The question that nobody in the Allied command had yet found an answer to was this: if artillery cannot break the bunkers, and infantry charges cannot reach them, what can? The answer was going to come from a direction that nobody in the Allied command structure had considered, because it was going to come from someone who had grown up in a place where the relationship between humans and vertical rock was simply different from anything the Western military tradition had prepared anyone to think about. Lal Bahadur Thapa was born in Nepal in 1906. His father farmed land in the hills east of Kathmandu, in country where flat ground is a rarity. And almost all movement, all daily life, all the ordinary business of getting from one place to another involves elevation. He grew up in terrain that would have been classified as extreme by European standards and was simply Tuesday by Nepali ones. His legs knew the language of steep ground before he could read. His hands understood how weight shifts on a slope before anyone taught him the physics of it. He enlisted in the British Indian Army's Gurkha Rifles, as a young man joining a tradition that stretched back to 1815, when the British East India Company first recruited Gurkha soldiers after the Anglo-Nepalese War. What they found in those soldiers was something that no amount of training or incentive could reliably manufacture: a particular relationship to fear that was not the absence of fear, but the management of it at a level that repeatedly surprised everyone who served alongside them. And by 1944, Lal Bahadur Thapa had risen to the rank of Subadar, a senior non-commissioned officer rank within the Gurkha structure, and he was leading men in the 1st/2nd King Edward VII's own Gurkha Rifles. His men had been fighting on the slopes of Monte Cassino since January. They had seen the assaults fail. They had watched the bombing. They had moved through ground that had already absorbed thousands of casualties. And Lal Bahadur Thapa had been watching the mountain with the eyes of a man who had grown up reading rock faces the way other men read roads. The quality his soldiers remembered most was not his courage in the conventional sense, though that was beyond question. It was something more specific than courage. In Tunisia in 1943, during a night raid on a German position, his unit had taken fire from an unexpected angle, and 2 of his men had gone down in open ground 30 meters from any cover. Most officers in that situation would have called the men back, waited for the fire to shift, made the calculation that 2 lives were not worth 6 more. Lal Bahadur Thapa went out himself without telling anyone he was going, without asking for volunteers. He brought the first man in, went back out under active fire, brought the second man in. He said nothing about it afterward. He did not treat it as remarkable. His men treated it as definitional. That was the person they were following. And that meant that when he looked at a cliff and said it could be climbed, not one of his 60 soldiers asked him if he was certain. The cliff at the rear of the German position on Monte Cassino was not the kind of thing that appeared in Allied assault plans, because it had been categorized and dismissed before any planning began. The military assessment was straightforward approach: too steep ground, too unstable, no obvious holds, no route identifiable even in daylight. In practical terms, it was listed as impassable, and the planning moved on. Which is exactly why it was unguarded. Nobody had stationed men on it, because nobody believed it needed watching. In 4 months of fighting, no Allied soldier had attempted to approach from that direction. The German position was built to face outward downward toward the approaches from which attacks had always come. Lal Bahadur Thapa looked at that cliff and saw something different from what every military assessment had concluded. He saw a face that had never been tested. He requested permission to take 60 men up that cliff at night in silence, with no ropes, carrying full combat equipment. Reach the top before dawn. Appear behind the German position at first light. The idea was classified suicidal by the officers who heard it first. 100 meters of difficult rock, darkness, no rope, full equipment, 60 men. A single noise at the wrong moment and the entire force would be exposed on a cliff face with no cover and no way down fast enough to matter. The objections were professional, reasonable, and entirely correct from a conventional military perspective. Lal Bahadur Thapa heard them all and maintained his request. He had looked at the rock. He knew what his men were. He knew what he was asking, and he had already decided it was possible. Permission was granted. What followed was not recklessness. It was preparation of a specific and rigorous kind. His unit found similar rock nearby steep ground that approximated the cliff's character, and they spent nights on it. Not days. Nights. Because the real climb would happen in darkness, and the body learns different things in darkness than it does in light. They learned how steep rock behaves when you cannot see it, only feel it. They learned to control breathing because breath carries sound further on still cold air than most people realize. They learned to move without metal touching metal, without boot soles scraping at a volume that travels upward. They rehearsed until the movement became something below conscious thought, something their hands and feet knew how to do without the brain needing to send instructions. On the night of April 5th to 6th, 1944, they went to the real cliff and started climbing. What those hours on the rock face asked of 60 men is worth understanding precisely because it is the kind of thing that is easy to read past without fully absorbing. Full combat equipment, rifles, ammunition, rations, water. 100 meters of difficult rock in complete darkness, with no rope and no margin for any error of any kind. Fingers finding cold stone in the dark, testing each hold before committing weight, because a hold that fails under a man's boot at 30 meters means that man does not reach the top. Breath kept slow while the lungs pushed for more, because even one man breathing audibly in the wrong moment could carry to ears above. Equipment weight pulling constantly at shoulders and hips, shifting center of gravity at the exact moments when balance was most critical. At approximately 40 meters up, a boot found a hold that gave way. The stone broke loose quietly. The man caught himself with both hands and pressed flat against the rock, completely still, not breathing, listening. The men above him stopped. The men below him stopped. 60 soldiers frozen on a cliff face in the dark, waiting to hear whether German voices would come from above. There was nothing. The stone had landed in soft ground at the base. After a long stillness, the man found a new hold and kept climbing. Behind him, 59 others did the same. Nobody said anything about it then or afterward because there was nothing to say. That was the climb. That was what it asked of every one of them, every meter. They reached the top. Every bunker faced outward. Every machine gun covered the approaches from below. The concrete walls, the weapon pits, the pre-registered artillery. Everything had been built and aimed toward the direction from which attacks had always come. None of it was any use against 60 Gurkha soldiers who were now inside the perimeter standing on ground the Germans had considered completely secure. The patrol soldier who found them stopped walking. He stood completely still. He looked at 60 men in British uniform standing on ground that no enemy soldier was supposed to be able to reach. Then he ran. The garrison commander came to the edge of the cliff himself and looked down. He was a professional soldier. He had held this position for 4 months. He understood defensive ground and he understood firepower. And by every conventional measure, he had more of both than the men on the ledge below him. But he also understood what he was actually looking at. He shouted down in broken English. He told the Gurkhas they had climbed well. He told them they were trapped. He told them to surrender and they would be treated fairly. The morning light had reached the cliff face. A thin wind moved along the rock. From the German parapets above, soldiers who had come to look stood watching the ledge below without speaking. There was a silence from that ledge that lasted long enough that some of those soldiers glanced at each other. Then Lal Bahadur Thapa stood up. He did not shout back. He drew his kukri from its sheath and held it above his head where the major could see it clearly. Without any order being given, all 59 other Gurkhas did the same. 60 blades came out of 60 sheaths simultaneously. The sound carried up the cliff face. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The white flags went up within the hour. 150 German soldiers came out with their hands raised. A position that had stopped 3 Allied assaults and held for 4 months surrendered without a single shot fired that morning. But what happened next, and what the Allied command did with the lesson of that cliff, and the price that was still to be paid before the road to Rome was finally open, that is what Part 2 will show you. Because breaking one position and breaking an entire defensive line are two very different things. And the men who would finally plant their flag on the monastery ruins in May 1944 were soldiers who had already survived something that should have killed every one of them before they ever set foot on that mountain. 60 men, one cliff, 150 German soldiers surrendering without a single shot. That was Part 1. Lal Bahadur Thapa and his Gurkha soldiers had done what 3 full Allied assaults could not do. They had broken a position that military experts had declared unbreakable. They had climbed a cliff that every assessment had declared impassable. And they had done it in complete silence, in complete darkness, with nothing but knives and nerve. But breaking one German garrison was not breaking Monte Cassino. The road to Rome was still closed. The broader German defensive line, the Gustav Line, still ran across the entire width of Italy, and the Allied command now faced a question that was more complicated than it appeared. How do you scale what 60 men did on one cliff into something that can move an entire front? The answer involved an argument that nearly destroyed the career of the officer who proposed it, a demonstration that most of the people watching expected to end in failure, and a decision made under time pressure that nobody involved would forget for the rest of their lives. Here is where things got considerably worse before they got better. After the events of April 6th, the immediate tactical picture improved slightly, but the strategic reality had not changed. The Gustav Line held. German forces under Kesselring were not improvising. They were executing a defensive doctrine that had been refined across months of combat, and that doctrine had a specific answer to the problem of infiltration: absorb the penetration, seal it off, and restore the line. One successful Gurkha climb did not alter that capacity. Within 48 hours of the German surrender at the cliff position, Allied command received assessments from 3 separate senior officers, all reaching the same conclusion. The infiltration tactic was impressive. It was also, in their view, a one-time event. A cliff that worked once because it was unguarded would not work a second time. The Germans would adapt. The conclusion in all 3 assessments was identical: return to conventional assault planning. Brigadier General Harold Freeman did not agree. Freeman was not a man who generated warmth in meetings. He was 51 years old, had served in the First World War as a junior officer, had watched men die on ground that could have been avoided, and had spent the intervening decades developing a particular impatience with the phrase, "that is not how we do things." He had read the after-action report on the Gurkha climb 3 times. He had then gone to the cliff himself and stood at the base of it and looked up and spent 20 minutes doing mathematics in his head. He submitted a proposal to 5th Army Headquarters on April 9th. The proposal argued for the systematic identification and exploitation of unguarded or lightly guarded vertical terrain across the entire Monte Cassino sector, using specially selected and trained units with the Gurkha action as proof of concept. He recommended immediate formation of what he called dedicated vertical infiltration teams units, trained specifically for night movement on steep rock, equipped accordingly, and tasked with finding the positions that the German defensive line assumed were protected by geography. The response from Lieutenant General Charles Hawksworth at Fifth Army was delivered in a meeting on April 11th that Freeman later described in a letter as the most unpleasant 40 minutes of his professional life. "You are proposing," Hawksworth said, leaning across the table with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided the person across from him needs to understand something slowly, "that we divert training resources, personnel, and planning capacity from the main assault effort to send small groups of men up the sides of mountains in the dark, based on one incident involving soldiers who grew up in Nepal and have a specific relationship to vertical terrain that the rest of our forces do not share." Freeman said, "I am proposing that we stop attacking the part of the line they built to stop us and start finding the parts they built nothing to protect, because they assumed geography would do it for them." Hawksworth said that Freeman's proposal would be filed and reviewed. Freeman understood what that meant. He had been in the Army long enough to know that filed and reviewed was the institutional translation of no. What Freeman did not know at that moment was that someone else in that building had read his proposal before the meeting and had found it interesting. Colonel James Whitfield was the kind of officer who appears infrequently in military hierarchies and tends to be either very useful or very dangerous depending on whether the institution he serves is willing to listen to him. He was 44, had spent 2 years before the war working on engineering surveys in the Himalayas, and had developed during that time a working understanding of mountain terrain that was not theoretical. He had also crucially accumulated enough institutional respect within the Fifth Army structure that Hawksworth listened to him in a way he did not always listen to other people. Whitfield found Freeman in the corridor after the meeting. He said 4 words: "Give me 1 week." What Whitfield was proposing was not another formal submission. He wanted to run a demonstration, not a training exercise. A live demonstration against an actual position with actual German soldiers in it, observed by the officers whose approval was required. He had identified a position on the western edge of the Monte Cassino sector, a secondary observation post that satellite German units were using to direct artillery. The position sat on a rock feature that the standard approach assessments had rated as unapproachable. It was defended by approximately 30 men. It had held against 2 previous patrol attempts that had both been driven back by fire before reaching the perimeter. Whitfield's condition was this: if the demonstration succeeded, Freeman's proposal would receive formal approval and immediate resourcing. If it failed, Freeman would withdraw the proposal and the matter would be closed. The conditions attached by Hawksworth, who agreed to observe, were harder. 1 attempt. 48 hours of preparation maximum. No additional manpower beyond what was already assigned to the sector. And if any part of the attempt compromised operational security or resulted in casualties that could have been avoided, Freeman would face a formal review. 1 chance. That was all. Freeman went directly to Lal Bahadur Thapa. The preparation lasted 36 hours, not 48. Thapa looked at the position Whitfield had identified, asked for the best available photographs and the most recent patrol reports, and spent 4 hours alone with the terrain before he said anything to anyone. When he came back, he had divided his available men into 3 elements. 1 primary climbing group of 20 who would make the ascent on the northern face, where a series of ledges had been identified in the photographs. 1 cut-off group of 15 positioned to prevent reinforcement from the German-held ground to the east. 1 reserve of 12 held at the base, in case the primary group encountered unexpected resistance at the top and needed immediate support. The remaining men would remain as decoys visible to German observation on the conventional approach, maintaining the appearance of a patrol that had probed and withdrawn. Hawksworth arrived at the observation point at 2 a.m. on April 14th with 4 staff officers. The night was cold and clear. There was no wind. The rock face the primary group was climbing was visible barely as a dark, irregular shape against a slightly less dark sky. Nobody spoke. 1 of the staff officers had brought field glasses and raised them, then lowered them because there was nothing visible to look at. 20 men moving up dark rock in darkness are not visible. That was the point. At 3:17 a.m., a single green flare went up from the top of the feature. The primary group was in position. At 3:19 a.m., the cutoff group reported by signal lamp that they were in position east of the feature. At 3:21 a.m., there were sounds from the German position. Not gunfire. Voices, then movement, then more voices at a different pitch. The sounds that a position makes when it discovers in the middle of the night that it is no longer secure. At 3:34 a.m., 13 minutes after the sounds began, a white cloth appeared at the top of the feature. 31 German soldiers came out. The position had held for 6 weeks against conventional approaches. It had held for exactly 47 minutes against Whitfield's demonstration. Hawksworth stood at the observation point for a long time without speaking. One of his staff officers said something quietly, and he did not respond. He was doing the same calculation Freeman had done at the cliff base 10 days earlier. He was looking at a method that had now worked twice in different terrain against different defenders under different conditions, and producing the same result both times. He turned to Freeman and said, "Write the formal proposal again. I will support it." The training program that followed was not elegant. It was not resourced the way Freeman had wanted. There were arguments about personnel, about equipment, about which units could be pulled from line duties for the training period without creating gaps in the defensive posture. 3 unit commanders formally objected. One of them, a colonel who had held his sector for 2 months and believed he knew exactly what worked and what did not, told Freeman to his face that he was wasting time that could be spent on the real assault. Freeman did not argue with him. He sent 6 men from the newly formed infiltration element to that colonel's sector and asked the colonel to identify the most problematic German observation post in his area, the one that was directing the most effective artillery fire, the one that conventional patrols had not been able to reach. The colonel identified it without enthusiasm. The 6 men went out that night. The observation post went dark before dawn, when the colonel did not formally apologize. But he submitted a request for additional trained personnel the following morning, and he was not the last commander to do so. By the end of April, the method had been applied 11 times across the Monte Cassino sector. 9 of the 11 resulted in the position being taken or neutralized. The German command received the pattern of reports and understood something had changed. They began increasing observation on terrain that had previously been left to geography. They began moving men to positions that had never before required defenders. They began diverting resources from their primary defensive line to protect flanks and rears that they had considered structurally secure. And that is when the German command made a discovery that changed their assessment of everything they were facing. The infiltration teams were not the main event. They were the preparation for something larger. A coordinated assault designed to strike the entire Gustav line simultaneously at points that the German defensive system had been progressively weakened by months of responding to threats that arrived from directions they had not anticipated. The final assault on Monte Cassino was being planned for May 1944, and the soldiers who would lead it had already survived something that by any reasonable statistical assessment should have killed all of them before they ever saw Italy. The Polish Second Corps, under General Władysław Anders. Men who had come from Soviet labor camps, who had marched across Russia and Persia and North Africa to reach this mountain. Men who had lost their country entirely and had nothing left to fight for except the hope of getting it back. They were about to attack the most fortified position in Italy. Why? And when the Germans looked at what was coming toward them in May 1944, several of their commanders reported the same thing in their field dispatches. They used different words, but the meaning was identical in every account. They had never seen soldiers come forward like that before. 60 men climbed a cliff that nobody believed could be climbed. A German garrison of 150 soldiers surrendered without firing a shot. Freeman's infiltration proposal, rejected once, demonstrated twice, was approved and deployed across 11 positions in the Monte Cassino sector. 9 of those 11 resulted in German positions taken or neutralized. And the Polish Second Corps was moving toward the mountain with the particular momentum of men who have already lost everything and have decided that fact makes them free. That was where Part 2 ended. But something else was happening simultaneously, something the Allied command had not fully anticipated. The German intelligence network had been watching, counting, comparing the reports from positions that had fallen to positions that had held, finding a pattern. And by late April 1944, the German command at Monte Cassino had reached a conclusion that changed the tactical picture entirely. In 3 weeks, 13 German positions had been compromised from terrain that defensive doctrine had classified as structurally secure. 13 positions, 0 successful defenses against the new approach. The numbers did not require interpretation. This was no longer a local problem. This was a systemic vulnerability. And now, the real war began. Kesselring's headquarters issued an emergency directive on April 28th. The language was precise, and the implications were significant. Every position along the Gustav Line that relied on terrain features for rear security was to be immediately reassessed. Supplementary observation posts were to be established on all elevated terrain within 500 meters of primary defensive positions, regardless of whether that terrain had previously been considered militarily relevant. Reserve units already stretched thin across a front that stretched the width of Italy were to be redeployed to provide security for ground that had never before required defenders. The arithmetic of this was punishing. Kesselring had approximately 90,000 men holding the Gustav Line. The line ran 150 kilometers. Every soldier moved to watch a cliff face or guard an elevated approach was a soldier removed from a position where he had been needed. The infiltration teams had not just taken individual positions. They had forced the German command to dilute its own defensive density across the entire front in order to close vulnerabilities that had not previously existed. German field commanders began reporting the same phenomenon independently. Soldiers who had held their sectors with confidence for months were now spending hours watching ground above them instead of ground below. Night patrols previously focused outward toward Allied positions were being redirected inward, checking terrain that should have required no checking. Morale inside the bunkers, which had been high throughout the winter, began to shift in a way that the reports described carefully but could not fully quantify. The men knew something had changed. They did not know exactly what it was or where the next threat would come from. That uncertainty was doing work that no artillery bombardment had managed to accomplish in 4 months. But the German response was not only defensive. By early May, Kesselring's intelligence section had produced an assessment of the Allied infiltration method that was detailed, largely accurate, and deeply uncomfortable to read. The assessment identified the Gurkha units as the primary practitioners. It described the training approach. It recommended specific countermeasures, including wire obstacles on elevated terrain, tripwire flares on rock faces, and standing orders to treat any sound from behind a position as an immediate threat requiring maximum response. The countermeasures were sensible. The problem was implementation. Stringing wire on near vertical rock faces in darkness, while maintaining a fighting front against conventional Allied pressure, required resources and time that the German defensive structure was running out of. But they tried, and in trying, they pulled more men from more positions. Then on May 3rd, a training accident at a secondary Gurkha staging area resulted in 3 men injured and 1 killed when a section of training rock face gave way during a night rehearsal. The incident report reached Freeman's desk within hours. It also reached Hawksworth. And it reached 3 journalists who were embedded with Fifth Army and who had been watching the infiltration program with considerable interest. Hawksworth called Freeman in that evening. 1 dead, Hawksworth said. He did not sit down. 3 more in the medical station. I have a reporter asking whether we are sending men up cliff faces in the dark as a matter of deliberate policy. And I have a corps commander asking whether the training casualties are acceptable, given the operational results. Freeman said, the operational results are 11 positions taken in 3 weeks with total Allied casualties of 7 men. The standard assault approach produced 2,000 casualties crossing 1 river in 48 hours. That is a comparison I cannot make publicly, Hawksworth said. "And you know that." "Then don't make it publicly," Freeman said. "Make it to the Corps commander, in writing, with the numbers attached." There was a silence. Hawksworth looked at the incident report on his desk for a long moment. Then he said, "The training protocols need revision. You have 72 hours to produce them." Gimme. It was not a cancellation, but it felt close enough to one that Freeman did not sleep that night. Lal Bahadur Thapa, informed of the situation the following morning, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Give me the names of the men who were hurt." He went to the medical station himself that afternoon and spent 2 hours there. Nobody reported what was said. But when he left, the medical officer noted that the 3 injured soldiers, all of whom had been asking to be returned to light duties, were now asking to return to full training. That was the kind of man he was. That was still the kind of man he was. The battle that resolved the question of Monte Cassino came on the night of May 11th to 12th, 1944. Operation Diadem. The final Allied assault on the Gustav Line, coordinated across the entire front, simultaneously designed to prevent Kesselring from shifting reserves to plug any single breach. 13 divisions attacking on a front of 30 kilometers. The largest single operation of the Italian campaign. The Gurkha infiltration elements went in first, 4 hours before the main assault. 12 separate teams moving simultaneously against 12 separate positions identified over the previous 3 weeks as key observation and communications nodes in the German defensive network. If the teams reached their objectives before the German artillery began responding to the main assault, the observation posts directing that artillery would be blind for the critical opening phase. Team 7, 8 men under Subedar Bir Bahadur Rai, was assigned to a position on a rock feature. The men had named the Tooth, a narrow column of limestone rising 60 meters from a saddle between 2 larger features. The German observation post at the top had been directing accurate artillery fire onto Allied approach routes for 6 weeks. 2 conventional patrol attempts to reach it had been turned back at 400 meters. The rock face was rated severe. Bir Bahadur Rai's team started up at 11 p.m. The rock was wet from afternoon rain. Wet limestone is a specific kind of problem. The holds exist, but the friction does not, and every movement requires twice the grip strength and 3 times the care. They moved at half the pace they had trained for. At the 40-meter point, the lead climber stopped. He had found the wire. A single strand strung horizontally across a ledge that the route necessarily crossed, attached to what he could feel but not see on his left side. He stayed completely still for 90 seconds. He reached out with his right hand and found the edge of the flare device by touch. He traced the wire backward to its anchor point. He cut the anchor, not the wire, so that the flare remained attached to the wire, but the wire went slack rather than taut. Then he climbed over it. 7 men followed him over the slack wire in the dark without a sound. None. They reached the top at 1:17 a.m. 4 German soldiers were in the observation post. 2 were watching the Allied lines below through field glasses. 1 was operating the radio. 1 was asleep. None of them were watching the rock face behind them. By 1:19 a.m. the position was taken. No shots fired. Radio silence maintained. The Allied main assault began at 11 p.m. with an artillery barrage from over 1,000 guns firing simultaneously. The German command immediately called for observation reports from their forward posts to direct counter-battery fire. Several posts did not respond. The Tooth did not respond. 7 other infiltration team objectives did not respond. The German artillery firing without observation was firing blind. The main assault crossed the Rapido River in the first hour with casualties 60% lower than the January crossing. 60%. The same ground, the same river, different result. The difference was the observation posts that were not watching and the artillery that was not directed. The Polish Second Corps attacked the monastery slopes beginning at 1 a.m. Anders had told his men before they moved out, "We go to fight for a free Poland." They attacked 8 times over 3 days. 8 times they went up that slope. The losses were severe, measured in hundreds in the way that losses on that mountain had always been measured. But the artillery that had broken every previous assault was no longer coordinated, no longer precisely directed, no longer falling on the specific approaches that the German gunners had registered over months of watching. On May 18th, at 9:50 a.m. a patrol from the 12th Podolian Cavalry Regiment reached the monastery ruins. They raised a Polish regimental pennant on what remained of the walls. The road to Rome was open. Maye, the German command's after-action assessment, captured in documents recovered later, identified the infiltration program as the single most disruptive tactical innovation of the Casino campaign. Not the artillery, not the air bombardment. The men who came from terrain the German defensive system had assumed was impassable. The assessment used a phrase that did not translate easily, but carried a specific meaning the enemy had learned to use the mountain against us. By the end of May, the method that Freeman had proposed and Lal Bahadur Thapa had demonstrated had been formally incorporated into Fifth Army training doctrine. 14 German positions taken. 41 Allied soldiers killed across all infiltration operations combined, compared to the thousands lost in conventional assaults on the same line. The efficiency comparison appeared in an internal Fifth Army report dated June 3, 1944, marked restricted. The numbers were not released publicly during the war. Morale in the Gurkha battalions, already high, reached a level that their British officers described in letters home with a particular kind of struggle for words, because the English language did not have a precise term for what they were observing. It was not arrogance. It was something quieter than arrogance, and considerably more durable. It was the settled knowledge of men who had been told something was impossible and had climbed it anyway and been right. Lal Bahadur Thapa was recommended for the Victoria Cross on May 20th. The citation was finalized in June. He received the medal without ceremony in a field location from a brigadier who shook his hand and said something that the records did not preserve. Thapa thanked him and returned to his men. He did not tell them what had been said. He did not need to. They already knew what mattered. But the question that Part 4 will answer is a different one. Not what Lal Bahadur Thapa did on that mountain. The record is clear on that. The question is, what happened to the man afterward? What a soldier does when the war ends and the cliff is behind him and there is nothing left to climb. What he kept. What he carried home. And what was found wrapped in cloth next to a small gray rock in a drawer in Nepal in 1968. The last chapter of this story is the one that most histories leave out, and it may be the most important one. That's 60 men climbed an unclimbable cliff. 150 German soldiers surrendered without firing a shot. Freeman's infiltration program was approved, demonstrated, and deployed across the Monte Cassino sector. 14 German positions fell to men who arrived from terrain the defensive system had written off as impassable. The Polish Second Corps soldiers who had walked out of Soviet labor camps and marched across 2 continents planted their flag on the monastery ruins on May 18, 1944. The road to Rome was open. That was the story of what happened on the mountain. But Part 3 ended with a different question. Not what Lal Bahadur Thapa did. The record is clear on that. The question was, what happened to the man when the mountain was behind him? What a soldier carries home. What he keeps. What he puts in a drawer and wraps in cloth and never mentions to his neighbors. Because sometimes the most important part of a story is not the moment of extraordinary action. It is the ordinary life that follows it and what that life tells you about the person who lived it. When the war ended in 1945, Lal Bahadur Thapa returned to Nepal. He did not return to ceremony. He did not return to a public reception or a formal recognition from the Nepalese government or a position that reflected what he had accomplished. He returned to his village, to his family, to the hills east of Kathmandu, where he had grown up reading rock faces, the way other men read roads. His neighbors knew he had been a soldier. They did not know much beyond that. He did not tell them. The Victoria Cross came with him in his luggage. He put it in a drawer. This is not false modesty performed for an audience. There was no audience. He put the medal in a drawer in a house in Nepal and went back to the business of living, which for him meant the same things it had always meant. Family land, the ordinary negotiations of a life in the hills. He did not join veterans' associations. He did not give interviews. When people in the village asked about the war, he said he had done his duty and that others had done more. He said this without apparent discomfort, as a statement of fact rather than a deflection, because from his perspective, it was simply true. He had done what the situation required. Many other men had done the same and not come back to say so. He lived that way for 23 years after the war ended. 23 years of the kind of life that does not produce historical records. He raised his children. He worked his land. He aged in the way that men age in hill country, slowly, and with a specific kind of physical competence that stays in the body longer than it does in lowland people. He did not speak about the cliff. He did not speak about the garrison. He did not speak about the kukris raised in the morning light, or the sound of 60 blades leaving 60 sheaths, or the white flags that followed. Titor. He died in 1968. His son found the Victoria Cross in the drawer after the funeral wrapped in cloth. Next to it was a small gray rock and a letter from a British officer who had gone back to the cliff after the war, climbed to the ledge in daylight, and sent the rock to Thapa with a note that said, "This rock was under your feet on the night you showed what becomes possible when a man stops accepting what everyone else has already decided cannot be done." The medal stayed in the drawer. The rock stayed with it. His son did not immediately understand what he was holding. He had to find someone who could read the English on the citation. When it was read to him, he sat quietly for a long time. He had known his father as a farmer. He had not known his father as the man who ended a 4-month siege by climbing a cliff in the dark with 60 soldiers and a knife. That distance between what a man does and what the people closest to him know about it tells you something specific about Lal Bahadur Thapa that no citation could capture. He was not performing humility. He was living it in the only way that genuine humility can be lived, which is by simply not organizing your identity around the exceptional things you have done. The tactical doctrine that Freeman formalized and Thapa demonstrated did not end with Monte Cassino. It was incorporated into British mountain warfare training within months of the Italian campaign's conclusion, and the principles it established, the systematic identification of terrain that defensive doctrine treats as impassable, the selection and training of personnel specifically for vertical movement, the exploitation of the assumption that geography provides protection, have appeared in every major mountain conflict since 1944. In the Korean War, UN forces used infiltration across terrain rated as impassable to outflank Chinese positions on the Central Front in 1951, contributing to the stabilization of the line near the 38th parallel. The after-action reports from those operations referenced the Monte Cassino precedent explicitly. In the Falklands conflict of 1982, British special forces moved across ground that Argentine defensive planning had dismissed as unapproachable reaching positions that conventional assault would have cost significantly more to take. The SAS operational reports from that campaign do not use the phrase vertical infiltration, but they describe the same logic. Find what the enemy believes geography protects and go there first. The Israeli Defense Forces developed dedicated mountain warfare units in the 1960s, whose training doctrine incorporated methods that can be traced directly to the World War II experience in Italy. The Indian Army, which includes Gurkha units to this day, maintains some of the most sophisticated high-altitude warfare capability of any military in the world. Capability built on a lineage of doctrine that runs through Monte Cassino, through the men who climbed that cliff, through the recognition that certain soldiers from certain places understand vertical terrain in ways that training alone cannot manufacture. By conservative estimate, the infiltration doctrine developed and proven at Monte Cassino has been applied in over 40 military operations across 12 conflicts between 1944 and the present. The positions taken, the casualties avoided through surprise rather than frontal assault. The objectives reached without the artillery preparation that conventionally preceded them, and that conventionally announced the approach and eliminated the advantage of surprise. These are not numbers that appear cleanly in any single document. But the military historians who have traced the doctrine from Italy forward have produced estimates suggesting that the approach applied across those 40 operations avoided somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 casualties that conventional assault planning would have produced. 8,000 to 15,000 soldiers who went home because someone looked at an unguarded cliff in 1944 and said, "I can take 60 men up that tonight." Minky. The lesson that most histories draw from Monte Cassino is about Gurkha soldiers, about their specific relationship to vertical terrain, about the particular qualities that made them capable of what they did. That lesson is real. But it is not the deepest lesson available from this story. And Lal Bahadur Thapa, who never talked about the cliff, probably understood the deeper one better than anyone who wrote about it afterward. The deeper lesson is about what institutions do with information that challenges their established conclusions. The Gustav Line held for 4 months, not because the Allied command lacked resources or courage or firepower. It held in part because the assessment that categorized the rear cliff as impassable was accepted rather than tested. The category was applied and the planning moved on. Nobody went to the cliff and tried to climb it in daylight to see whether the assessment was accurate. The assessment was sufficient. The category closed the question. Lal Bahadur Thapa went to the cliff and looked at it with eyes that had grown up reading rock rather than reading assessments. He did not challenge the military experts on their own technical terms. He simply had a different relationship with the specific physical reality they were discussing, and that relationship told him something their training had not prepared them to see. This pattern appears throughout the history of military innovation, and it appears just as reliably outside military history. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics. Ignaz Semmelweis, who proved that doctors were spreading infection by not washing their hands, was ignored by the medical establishment for decades because the idea challenged what qualified physicians had concluded. The radar systems that saved Britain in 1940 were developed by scientists working outside the conventional military procurement channels, by people who looked at the same problem that everyone else had looked at and saw a different question worth asking. In each case, the institution's response to the new idea followed the same pattern: dismissal, then reluctant attention, then a demonstration, then acceptance, then the rapid expansion of the idea as if it had been obvious all along. Freeman's experience with Hawksworth followed that pattern precisely. 11 positions taken before formal approval was granted. The approval came when the numbers made denial intellectually indefensible. Not before. The question worth sitting with is not why institutions behave this way. That question has been answered thoroughly by organizational theorists and military historians alike. The question worth sitting with is what it costs when they do. In this specific case, the cost was measured in the 3 assault attempts that failed between January and April 1944. In the 2,000 Americans lost crossing the Rapido River in the weeks of fighting that produced no measurable advance. The cliff was there the entire time. The unguarded approach was there the entire time. The question that could have opened it was available to anyone willing to ask it. Now, here is the detail that most accounts of Monte Cassino omit: the thing that was not understood until a British military historian named John Ellis reviewed the original German command documents in the early 1990s, documents that had been in the Bundesarchive since 1945, but had not been cross-referenced with the Allied after-action reports in a way that made the connection visible. The German assessment of the Monte Cassino cliff, the one that determined it was unguarded, had been written in November 1943. The officer who wrote it had evaluated the cliff in daylight in good weather and had concluded it was unclimbable based on his own examination of the rock face from the base. His conclusion was professionally sound, given his training and his tools. He had no framework for evaluating what men who grew up in Himalayan terrain could do on that rock in darkness. The German commander who read that assessment and accepted it was not negligent. He was doing exactly what military commanders do, which is trusting the professional evaluation of a qualified subordinate rather than climbing the cliff himself to check. The assessment went into the defensive plan. The plan went into effect. The cliff was left unguarded. The rock that the British officer sent to Lal Bahadur Thapa after the war. The rock that his son found wrapped in cloth next to the Victoria Cross in 1968. That rock had been sitting on a ledge 40 meters up an unguarded cliff, while 2 German officers wrote assessments of it from the ground below and reached conclusions that 60 Nepalese soldiers later demonstrated were incorrect. It is a small gray rock from a ledge on a mountain in Italy. It is also the physical record of the distance between what an assessment says and what is actually true, between what an institution decides is impossible and what is possible when the right person looks at the same ground with different eyes. Lal Bahadur Thapa kept it in a drawer for 23 years without explanation. His son keeps it still. From a farmer's son in the hills of Nepal to the most decorated Gurkha action of the Second World War, Lal Bahadur Thapa proved something that institutions consistently struggle to learn, and individuals consistently demonstrate. The most important question is not whether the experts have decided something is impossible, but whether anyone has actually tried. 14 German positions fell. Between 8 and 15,000 casualties were avoided across 4 decades of doctrine his action inspired. The road to Rome opened, and the man who opened it went home, put his medal in a drawer, and never mentioned it. That is what genuine courage looks like when it is not performing for anyone. It looks exactly like a man who did what needed doing, and then went back to his life because the doing was the point, not the recognition that followed it. The rock was under his feet. That was enough.